That's what I thought. Oh. That's what I thought. Like we did there, that worked pretty well.
Hello.
No, she's no. Oop.
Whoops. So we'll start tonight with just a few prayers as we've been doing, and we're going to go to page 73 of the prayer book here. We're doing the Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. We'll do this 3 times in English, and then we'll go forward to do the mandala offering and the refuge prayer. Again, page 73. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. So to do the short mandala offering, it's going to be either on page 97 or 98 of your prayer book, depending upon the version you have. And tonight we'll do this, let's do this in the Tibetan, just the first verse, and then the offering mantra, Idam Guru, and so on page 98. After that, we'll do refuge and bodhicitta, once in English and twice in Tibetan. Sajipoki Zhuxing Me Tok Tramri Rablingji Ni De Gyan Padi Sangye Jingdu Mikte Uwaryi Dokun Dak Jingla Chuparsho Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jang chu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyan gi peso nam gi drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyangi pesanamgi drola penchir sangye druparsho. Okay, then let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, let go of any distractions, and then generate a good motivation for being here. So just do a few minutes of focused meditation on the breath in whatever way suits your mind, trying to maintain your awareness of the breath and to be vigilant to make sure that when the mind wanders, that you bring the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And to do this, we can think about the Four Noble Truths, the first teaching that the Buddha gave. And in the very first truth, the Buddha is saying that the suffering that we see in the world, what we would call our manifest suffering, suffering that's quite evident to us, is really just only a portion of what goes on in the world. That sentient beings are also experiencing the suffering of change, meaning that all their pleasurable experiences don't have the ability to last, to be sustained, that only give temporary relief. And then the deepest level of suffering, that we are under the control of our karma and delusions and thereby subject to suffering. We're conditioned in this way. As Lama Zopa says, kind of compound our suffering from life to life, from moment to moment, because we're always under the control of these factors. And that leads us into the second truth, which is the causes of our suffering reside within ourselves. For a lot of suffering, we like to find blame outside of ourselves. We like to think that others are responsible for what we experience. The Buddha says that we have created it all through the force of our delusions and then the karma that comes from those delusions. It arises in conjunction with those distorted states of mind. So we already see in just looking at the first two truths that we have to know our minds in order to address the causes of our suffering. And the Buddha says in the third noble truth that through doing this, we can achieve a cessation of our suffering. We can uproot all the causes of our suffering because they reside within our minds and are not inherent to our minds, because they are deluded and therefore not grounded in truth. And the path, the fourth noble truth, that will lead to that suffering, or the end of that suffering, is something that we have to then engage in, that we have to take serious. We have to make a wholehearted effort in accomplishing. And that's really what we're doing here by being here tonight, is partaking of these teachings on minds and mental factors so that we can gain better control over our minds and the actions that come from our minds. And in this way, eventually do the deepest work that will allow us to attain that third noble truth, the true cessation of our suffering and all the causes of our suffering. But to achieve all of this for ourselves alone, while that is quite a noble effort, is insufficient because we have countless sentient beings who are suffering just like ourselves. And all these sentient beings have been incredibly kind to us, lifetime after lifetime. So take responsibility for those sentient beings by generating this mind of bodhicitta, thinking that you're here not just to accomplish your greatest purpose through freeing your mind from all these obscurations and achieving all the perfect qualities, but you're doing this primarily so you can be in the best position to benefit sentient beings, most of whom don't even have an idea of what they are dealing with, most of whom require wisdom and compassion, guidance in their lives, and think that we're here for each and every one of them as much as you can generate that mind. Okay, so we're going to resume with just a few things before we get into new material. Let me do the screen sharing, and I haven't still really figured out exactly how I'm going to do this screen sharing thing with being able to toggle back and forth that easily. Seems like once I get into that, then it sometimes is a little bit harder to come back out of it. But let me try again and see what happens when I do this. Okay, so now we have the slide up on our screen, but I'm not sure if it's up on the screen for the folks who are in. I might have to actually, yeah, it should be there. Can someone there, Jane, or someone at Lama Yeshe House, let me
Not
know?
seeing it.
You're not seeing it. Okay, let me click out of that. Oh, I know. It's because I didn't hit share screen. Okay, let me go to that and share screen. Okay. Is it
Yeah.
up now? Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right, so we're in the third session of this course. And again, if you do have some questions from the first two, we'll have a moment. I want to do a little bit of material that's kind of touching on one of the points that I was on last week, just to elaborate a little bit more, because I had a question from Nancy, actually, not Nancy here, Nancy there. We have two Nancys here tonight, on this whole idea of mental direct perception that I talked about. So I'm going to kind of do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about that topic. So first of all, just to review, we have minds and mental factors. It's the topic of this course. So we're looking at this idea of the main minds or primary minds, and then the mental factors. So the most of the course will be discussing these mental factors, and I'll get into a brief definition of those in just a moment. So Prabhuchak, in the very first course in the text that we use when we study mind and cognition in terms of Buddhist epistemology, how the mind knows, the definition that was given there of a main mind is a main knower that is posited by way of apprehending the entity of its object. So this is kind of just that mere knowing that is simply knowing the entity of an object. It's not knowing all the various specific attributes and aspects and so on. That's the function of the mental factors. So there were when we divided up main minds, we divided them into two initially, the sense consciousnesses, which consist of the five: eye consciousness, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then mental consciousness. So this is the two different kind of ways that we have of bringing phenomena into our awareness. Mental consciousness can know all phenomena eventually, but our sense consciousnesses are somewhat limited in terms of what they can individually know. I also looked at, and this is where the questions came in to some degree, is when I looked at this idea of conceptual and non-conceptual awarenesses. This isn't a main topic of this course, but I felt like I needed to introduce it because we're going to be talking throughout this course about how our conceptual awarenesses, our conceptual consciousness, is what gets us into trouble. It's really not our sense consciousnesses that are the problem, though we're bringing in lots of stimulating data through those five sense consciousnesses, but it's what we do with our conceptual mind, which is entirely in the domain of our mental consciousness. So we can talk about dividing consciousness besides what I did just in the previous slide of dividing them into main minds, into those that are sensory and those that are mental. We can also divide them into those that are conceptual and those that are non-conceptual. And it's not an identical division then. We have overlapping in terms of not everything that is non-conceptual is sensory, and not but everything that is conceptual is certainly in our mental consciousness, but we do have some mental consciousness that is direct. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because there were questions in terms of that particular category. So if we divide consciousness in this second way, and we say that all of our main minds can be either conceptual or non-conceptual, we're mostly talking about how they get at their objects. Our conceptual minds are always dealing with a mental image. I went through this last time, this donchi, which is, as described here on the slide, a mentally projected entity that, whilst not being the object, appears as though it were. So this is whenever our conceptual awareness goes into operation, we're always working with an idea of an object. This word image isn't meant to think of just something visual. An image can be of an auditory experience. I can tell you right now to think of the first few notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? Okay, Nan just gave the notes here in the Gompa. So we have that can be an audio image, if you will. Something that appears to our mind that is, in the nature of seeming like it's sound, but it's not actual sound. It's an image of what that sound is that you've heard. Just like, the smell of cinnamon, you can all bring to mind the smell of cinnamon, but you're not actually smelling cinnamon. You're always working with an idea of that object. Anytime conceptual awareness is involved, it has a mental image. Non-conceptual consciousnesses, as it says here, get at their objects directly. So as I said, sensory consciousnesses are all direct. They are all knowing their objects without that medium of a mental image, without that kind of something between the consciousness and the object. But there are also mental consciousnesses that are direct. And I talked about two of these in the last class briefly. The one that I'm going to go into a little more detail that Nancy had her question about, or that is related to the question that she had, is what we would just simply call a mental direct perceiver, which there can be two types of, and I only really went into one of them the last time. But in essence, the second one, the main other mental, or the one that's in the mental consciousness, is what we call yogic direct perceivers. And yogic direct perceivers are what we are aiming for in our spiritual practice, which is to accomplish this union of calm abiding and special insight that is observing something and knowing it directly without that medium of a mental image. So when it comes to knowing selflessness or emptiness, we have to first work with a mental image. We have to first work with an idea of what emptiness is. And then over repeated exposure to it through meditation, eventually that image falls away and we know emptiness directly. That's a yogic direct perceiver. It will always be done with the union of calm abiding and special insight, and will involve an experience of that object that is unlike anything that's occurred prior to that conceptually. And then we repeat that again and again, and that's the whole process of removing our delusions and the karma that's created by them, and eventually achieving nirvana and enlightenment. But this other form of direct perception or non-conceptual awareness that happens in the mental consciousness includes a couple of things. So this slide, again, just kind of recaps a little bit of what I just said. Sense consciousnesses are necessarily non-conceptual. Mental consciousnesses can be either conceptual or non-conceptual. And the example that I had on the slide last time, which is repeated here, is mental direct perceivers. A mental direct perceiver is usually differentiated from a yogic direct perceiver. They're both in the mental consciousness. But again, I'm recapping some stuff that was in part one that we didn't do before this, and there's good reason to do it before it because you do get all of this background. But frankly, you're not going to need that much more background as we continue through the mental factors. This is just to get you into the ballpark of knowing what we're talking about. So let's go to the next slide where we talk about this mental direct perceivers. I didn't mention the second of these last time, but the first one I did talk about. And this is kind of the function that takes place in the mental consciousness that is a direct perception, that acts kind of as this bridge to take the object that we've gotten in through our sense awarenesses and allows the conceptual consciousness to kind of make its own image of it, if you will, and know it through the force of that. So the very first one is described here as a single moment of mental direct perception generated at the end of the continuum of sense direct perception. So say I'm seeing the color blue, and my eye consciousness is taking that in. Before my conceptual mind starts to take hold of it and think about it and compare it to other blues I've seen and decide whether I like it or don't or whatever, well then there is this moment of, and again it's very brief, they say it's 1/65th of a finger snap, that there's this bridge that occurs where my mental consciousness knows that blue directly. But it's so brief that it's impossible for us to discern it. It's just acting as a sort of synapse to help bring it into our conceptual awareness. And then we start working with an image of blue. We immediately have a mental image of that blue, and we are, again, going through our own overlay of all the conceptual stuff we do around that blue that we're seeing. The other one that's, again, not what I talked about last week. I didn't want to get too complicated last week, but as long as I'm doing the presentation tonight, I thought I'd throw it in there, is the other type of mental direct perceiver is a clairvoyance, where we can know something directly through developing a clairvoyance. Clairvoyances are developed on the basis of one of the four concentrations. The four concentrations go beyond calm abiding, that initial level of calm mind that we generate, and you develop through a whole process each of these individually, the first concentration, second, third, fourth. When you develop any one of them, you have the basis upon which the clairvoyances can be generated. A clairvoyance is, for example, the clairvoyance knowing another's mind. And if I had that right now, I could turn my awareness to anyone's mind and know what's going on in their mind. Or a clairvoyance that knows past lives. I'm sorry? Like Google. So this one I'm not going to talk about so much, but it's just something to know. This isn't yet yogic in any way, but though it does obviously involve meditative ability to accomplish it. But it's not a yogic direct perceiver because that's where we would be seeing selflessness or impermanence or subtle impermanence of various other objects. So let me talk a little bit more about this first type of mental direct perceiver, because Nancy's question was essentially, she wasn't sure exactly still about what's happening between what comes in through our sense consciousnesses and then how our mental consciousness or mental awareness gets involved. So our mental consciousness has kind of two parts when we start to engage in the object conceptually. The first one is that we have to bring the data in through this mental direct perceiver. And that mental direct perceiver, again, acts as a bridge between the sense direct perception of the physical object, which is our eye consciousness seeing the color blue, for example, that I just mentioned, and the conceptual cognition of that object. For example, the conceptual mental consciousness indirectly knowing the color blue via a mental image. So it's, again, happening quite instantaneously. It's not like we think about doing this. Oh, I need to bring that data in and then I need to generate an image of it. It's just how our mind works. All of our conceptual consciousnesses are working with mental images, but to get those mental images of things that are in our sensory field, we need to first bring the data in, obviously, through a sense consciousness, and then we have that moment where it comes into our field of awareness through this mental direct perception, and a sort of snapshot, if you will, is taken of it. That sounds like a strange way to put it, but there's an image that we create on the basis of that we then mistake to be the actual object. So when we think about the color blue, we think we're thinking about the actual color blue, but we're only thinking about an image of the color blue. But how it comes into our field of awareness is through this process. At the end of a sense direct perceiver perceiving its object, in this case, the eye consciousness perceiving blue, we then have that bridge, that moment, that 1/65th of a finger snap that occurs that allows us to take that data into our mental consciousness in a direct way, but it immediately gets the conceptual overlay with this mental image. And then we start thinking about it, as I said, and we cogitate over it. And of course, it happens, quite naturally with regard to a variety of objects. The last slide here is just kind of to show you then that kind of summarize here. Although those moments of mental direct perception know their particular sense object, such as the color blue, non-conceptually, their duration is so short, 1/65th of a finger snap, that they are unable to induce any recollection or ascertainment of the object. So these are essentially, in course 1, we talk about them being inattentive perceptions. It happens so quickly that we're not attentive to that. We can't really recall that 1/65th of a finger snap moment when that mental direct perception of the color blue occurred. We immediately just latch on to our image of the color blue and start working with that. So again, it's just to give a little bit more background. Did that help, Nancy? Okay, good. Yeah, Charmaine. Is the mental direct perception free from ignorance? Well, we don't have ignorance as a conception, so we would only have ignorance present in a manifest way when we have a conceptual consciousness present. It will still be there in a non-manifest way whenever we've got anything else present. For example, our sense consciousnesses or this mental direct perceiver. But it doesn't mean that it's gone completely. It just means it's not manifest. Right. So Charmaine's question, I'm doing this for the folks online here. Charmaine's question is when you have the sense direct perception of an object, let's say the color blue, and then you have this mental direct perception in that 1/65th of a finger snap knowing the color blue, is the ignorance operative then? It will come in as soon as we overlay the conception of inherent existence on top of that, which might, again, it would be impossible to say in terms of when that occurs, but for most of us, we're going to think things exist inherently pretty quickly after we know them. It's right. It's correct. Correct. Her question is, it's a process of the conceptual mind that's doing this, not the direct perception. Absolutely. Because all of what we're going to be getting into in terms of once we get to the mental factors and particularly the afflictions is that all of these are conceptual minds. We can't say that our eye consciousness has attachment to the color blue. It is our conceptual mind that has attachment to the color blue. Okay? When we get to that level of talking about attachment or aversion, anger, what have you. Yeah, Jane. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. For this donchi, this mental image, yeah. Jane was saying about the example of if you wear glasses, you don't see the glasses when you're looking through the glasses, but the glasses are there as kind of acting as a medium through which you are taking in that information. Again, the idea though is with the mental object is the mental image is just to be sure again that it isn't in any way the actual object. It's related to the actual object because we need to bring in that data to get at it. But we do have stuff that's entirely within the mental domain too, right? Emptiness, for example. I mean, when you think about emptiness, you're not looking at a object that is emptiness and coming to know it through your eyes or your ears and what have you. You're coming to know it through your conceptual mind, through hearing about emptiness, analyzing for emptiness, investigating it, and so on. So there is some domain of objects, phenomena that are entirely in the mental sphere. But then a lot of what we bring in is through the five sense consciousnesses, which is visible form, sound, smell, taste, tangible sensations. All of these are brought in through those doors. And so for all of those, we need to have this moment of mental direct perception that acts as the bridge to bring them into our awareness, our mental consciousness, so that we can then know them in this conceptual way via that mental image. Okay? Yeah, Nan. Right. Mm, yeah. Well, these questions are starting to get outside of the realm of maybe too far away from what we're trying to, the point we're trying to bring home. But to answer it briefly, I mean, the question was about an infant's awareness when you've got an infant who is knowing objects in this way because they do have some form of a conceptual awareness. But would the ignorance be present because, or is ignorance a learned thing? Ignorance is learned to some degree. We do have a reification that occurs through an acquisition of that, but we do have it inherently or innately as well, not inherently, innately. Innate means it's inborn, means that we carry it from life to life. And so we will have the activation of the seeds of that, because they're all in our minds, the seeds of that ignorance that will ripen into our mistaken knowing. But it gets quite complex because we have to, I mean, I don't want to again go too deeply into that. Let's talk about that when we get to ignorance and to the view of the transitory collection. So, was there another question? Yeah. Stephen.
Yeah, Don. So there's the sense consciousnesses, then there's the mental direct receiver, then there's the mental consciousness. Does that mean that
Conceptual mental consciousness. Okay.
does that mean that all the 51 factors are concomitant with mental consciousness, or can they be the
Right.
sense consciousness? So how does that work?
So Stephen's question is, which of these consciousnesses have the 51 mental factors in their retinue, or are they only limited to some? And it's true, some of them will not be present in certain awarenesses, simply because they're conceptual and involve a conceptual overlay. But as we go through them, we can maybe talk about that in each grouping and see what goes on. Because the first 5 that we'll hopefully get into later tonight are the omnipresent, meaning that they are present in all of our consciousnesses. So whether we have a sensory consciousness knowing, eye consciousness knowing the color blue, or whether we have a mental consciousness conceiving of the inherent existence of blue, they're all going to have those 5 present. Okay. So can we see, let me see if there's any other general questions, either from Denver or anyone who's online, in terms of what I've talked about so far. Just have a little bit more to do, and then we'll get into the new material. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about mental factors. This is still review, because I just wanted to do this for, we've got a few new people who are joining tonight. And I won't be doing this for everyone. You know, this will be tonight, and then I think starting going forward, we won't be doing much review. We're just going to keep moving forward. Definition of a mental factor from Perbuchak from the first course is a knower that apprehends any of the features of its object and accompanies whatever main mind has similarity with it. So again, this is knowing that the mental factor has a more specific function. It's to know the attributes or features, aspects of the object, to engage in some sort of a function around that object, whereas the main mind is simply knowing it in a very general way, knowing the mere entity of it. So the mental factors engage the particularities of the perceptual field, whereas the main mind is defined as just knowing the perceptual field. This is from Venerable George's commentary. So again, this is one way to see it. We went through a number of other ways that we're actually going to go through that tonight, a number of other ways that we can talk about the relationship between these two. So last week I did cover then what the differences are between these two, and that kind of focuses on these two definitions, that main minds are knowing in that very general way, whereas mental factors knowing in a much more specific way. Let's continue forward with the relationship of these, going to page 10. Again, we have covered a few pages past this, so I kind of skipped around a little bit in how I was covering this. At the very bottom of page 10 of the text, this is the text that all of you have, A Necklace for Those of Clear Awareness, composed by Yeshe Geltsen. On page 10 at the bottom, it says, are a mind and its mental factors one entity or different entities? And the response comes from the Treasury of Knowledge, the Abhidharma Kosha, stanza 223, says, a mind and its mental factors are definitely simultaneous. So what we're going to talk about and going into the relationship with this is that a mind and its mental factors are all happening at the same time and really are all part of the same bucket, if you will. You know, the differentiation between these two is simply in the way of this idea of isolate that we used last week. An isolate is a way of mentally isolating something through our conceptual awareness. So conceptually, we're going to be talking about all these various facets or features of different moments of mind that we can parse up into various mental factors that are occurring at the same time that our general awareness is knowing something. So anytime we have, for example, that old familiar eye consciousness knowing blue, seeing blue, we'll use that frequently. You have the eye consciousness, which is the main mind. It is having similarities with all of the mental factors that are present at that time. And the mental factors that are present at that time share those similarities with the main mind. They're all occurring within the same bucket of awareness. But we're going to parse them up and talk about them in very distinct ways, because we can do that with our conceptual mind. That's the wonders of our conceptual mind, is that we can actually come to know different things, discriminate, differentiate. Discrimination is one of our mental factors even, that we can isolate and say this is this, that is that. So we're going to be doing that with regard to these. So let's continue on with the text. I'll read page 11. It says, just as it has been said above, a main mind and its mental factors arise together simultaneously. Not being different entities, they are the same entity. Moreover, the two, a main mind and the mental factors in its retinue, are said to be one entity and concomitant by way of the 5 types of similarities. So concomitant means occurring or existing, at the same time, concurrently. And so the idea is that there's going to be these 5 similarities that we'll explore shortly that delineate the ways in which those are the same entity, because they have the same object, the same time, and so on, all these various things that we look at. So he says, hence, it is incorrect to assert that minds and mental factors are not similar in time, and that they are different entities, as well as to posit that their observed objects are separate. So as we'll see when we look at these similarities, it gives us a flavor for the sameness of that experience. That you can't have a mental factor, for example, that's observing the color red while the eye consciousness is observing the color blue. If the eye consciousness is observing blue, the mental factors in its retinue will be observing blue. Okay. To explain this clearly, when the mindfulness of an object, mindfulness is one of our 51 mental factors, when the mindfulness of an object, for instance, a form, is produced, the two, the mind and the mindfulness in its retinue, are similar in observing the object, form. Nevertheless, they are posited separately. The knower of the mere entity of the object, form, is called mind, but from the point of view of the function of acting not to forget, mindfulness. So it's, again, you have this awareness that is knowing the object, and we would call that the mind, that is knowing form, for example. But when it comes to not forgetting that object, that's the specific function of mindfulness. We're going to divide that off and call it something separate. We're going to call it mindfulness. We're going to call this mind that mindfulness, but they're not completely distinct and different because they're arising within the same moment of consciousness. So when we have, for example, an eye consciousness observing form, then the mindfulness of that form is present at the same time, and we can talk about it separately, but it's really all part of the whole experience. So the benefit of doing this type of investigation is to understand the complexity of what's all going on in our awareness. We sometimes think our minds are pretty simple, but they're actually very complex in terms of all the different features and functions that are occurring at the same time. So he says here in the next sentence, it is not the case that they have separate entities like a pillar and a vase. And the idea behind that is, if you got rid of the vase, if you smash the vase to bits, it doesn't affect the pillar at all, right? They're 2 separate entities. Whereas if we got rid of the mindfulness of form, we would definitely not have the mind knowing form, and vice versa. That they are going to be together with the same object in that case, looking at how they possess the same object. These modes, it says, have been set forth in accordance with how it has been taught in Gyaltsup's Essence of the Ocean of Knowledge, an explanation of the Compendium of Knowledge, Gedendrup's Ornament of Reasoning, the great treatise on valid cognition that explains that the definition of a main mind is that which is concomitant by way of the 5 similarities with the mental factors in its retinue. And the definition of a mental factor is that which is concomitant by way of the 5 similarities with its main mind. So it's kind of another definition for these two is just simply saying that they are going to be concomitant with each other, and that we define one by it being concomitant with the other and the other by being concomitant with the one. Sounds kind of strange. It's not a very descriptive definition, but it's kind of giving that idea that, again, you never have these things not arising concurrently. The mental factors that are in the retinue, which will be varied, you can never have all 51 mental factors in the retinue because some of them are diametrically opposed to each other. But any of the mental factors that are present while a particular moment of consciousness is operative are concomitant with it. They arise together with it and so on. We're going to look at these 5 similarities that really spell out what that looks like. And they're presented in 2 different ways. So before I go on to that, I'm going to just do a few more slides that are from Geshe Rabtin's book. I know that many of you can't get Geshe Rabtin's book because it's quite pricey on the internet at Amazon and so on, and used copies. So I'm sharing a number of the pieces from there in slides. He says, firstly, we should understand that a primary mind and its attendant mental factors always operate in conjunction with one another. An object is never cognized by a primary mind devoid of any mental factors, nor by a mental factor unaccompanied by a primary mind. These things cannot occur. Okay, so that already gives a flavor for what we're talking about. Primary mind or main mind and mental factors are always arising together, never individually, separately. The term primary mind, or what we use as main mind, denotes the totality of a sensory or mental state composed of a variety of mental factors. A primary main mind is like a hand, whereas the mental factors are like the individual fingers, the palm, and so forth. So we can say that the totality of it is the hand, but you can talk about all the various individual pieces, all the parts of any individual finger even. And so in a sense, what we're talking about when we go into this delineation of the mental factors is something that exists kind of within the sphere of what the main mind is experiencing, but it's not what the main mind is in essence, because the main mind is the larger, again, mere awareness of the object, whereas the mental factors are much more specific. Geshe Rabtin continues, he says, in this respect, the relationship of a primary mind and its mental factors is somewhat similar to an overseer and a group of workers. So this is another analogy. We have the hand with the fingers. Now this is another way of looking at it as like the overseer and a group of workers. Each worker is solely occupied with his or her own specific tasks, whilst the overseer is equally conscious of what each worker is doing without being directly involved in any one of their individual activities, hopefully. If you've ever been working for anybody who's getting involved in your activities, you don't want them to be. But in this example, the primary mind is incapable really of affecting those to some degree, but can become aware of them. Like right now, I can ask you to become aware of, the very first mental factor we're going to talk about is feeling. Feeling is the sort of feeling tone, if you will, that you're having, whether you're experiencing something pleasant, something neutral, or something unpleasant. And so I can ask you to become conscious of what it is that you're experiencing. And maybe some of you might be cold in the room, and so you have an unpleasantness of the cold, air, or you might have the pleasantness of whatever, experiencing being here, whatever is going on for you. Or you might just be neutral at this moment, So we can become aware. The main mind can sort of bring its awareness to what's going on in the individual mental factors, but the mental factors are going to kind of do their own job. They just kind of keep functioning. So you never kind of you never like turn your feeling off and on. You don't say, okay, I'm not going to feel anything right now. I'm not going to register any kind of sort of feeling tone or experience. You're rather always going to be experiencing that. But whether you're aware of it or not is another issue. That's one reason, again, why we explore this whole topic, is to become aware of everything that's happening in the landscape of our mind. This is another way we can look at it. So we saw the hand and the individual parts of the hand. We saw the overseer and the worker. Geshe Tashi Tsering, in his book Buddhist Psychology, that's part of the Foundation of Buddhist Thought series, he says there are many metaphors to describe the relationship between the main mind and the mental factors. In some ways, we can see the main mind as the screen in a cinema, with the mental factors, the images projected upon it. We never really see the screen because we're so caught up in the stories projected onto it. The mental factors color and determine our understanding of the main mind, which is much more neutral and unadorned. And this is kind of true when we talk about it from that category, that idea of it being sort of the overriding awareness, it gets flavored and colored by everything else that's going on with the mental factors, which also, again, is giving credence to why we study this, because we want to know what mental factors are most beneficial to color our main minds with, as opposed to those that are going to cause us to have unhealthy experiences that are diluted and that only lead to more suffering and so on. So let's go on then to these 5 similarities. Again, there'll be an opportunity for some questions in a bit. I want to go a little bit longer in the lecture and then see if there's questions that arise. So take note of questions if they come up so that you don't forget them. In the middle of page 11, it says, regarding the modes of the 5 similarities, there are 2 explanations. One from the Treasury of Knowledge, which is the Abhidharma Kosha, and that's written by Vasubandhu, and one from Asanga's Compendium of Knowledge, the Abhidharma Samuccaya. This is actually the text. I may have said the wrong name of the text in the first class. This is the text that is called the Mahayana presentation of Abhidharma, or of higher knowledge, whereas the Hinayana one is Vasubandhu's. But he's going to draw upon both of these main texts. These are kind of the source for this entire topic of minds and mental factors, is those 2 texts. The Abhidharma Kosha is a text by Vasubandhu that we studied in the master's program as part of the studies of that. And it's really just an entire encyclopedia of phenomenology, of everything that exists, and one whole chapter is dedicated to all the various things going on in our minds. I haven't studied Asanga's text, but it is, again, a Mahayana version of that. So there are different presentations. Nonetheless, most of what we're going to be looking at in this course is defining all of these mental factors, particularly ignorance, that was brought up earlier, in the light of the higher teachings of the Mahayana, particularly the middle way consequence school, the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So let's go on to the very first 5. This is on the next slide. This is according to Treasury of Knowledge, Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha. We see that these 5 are also on page 11. And let's just go through them one at a time. The very first one, similar support. The meaning that's given on page 11 at the bottom for similar support is that since a mental factor is also supported by that sense power upon which the mind is supported, their supports are similar. So this goes back to earlier on in last class, no, or maybe it was the first class. I did talk about it a little bit last class as well. We have what we call the supports, or the bases, the powers for different consciousnesses to be generated. So let's talk about the 5 sense ones. For your eye sense consciousness to know visible form, to know color, to know shape, you have to have what's called the eye sense power, which in Buddhist thinking isn't the eyeball itself, but is a very subtle lucid matter that exists within the eyeball that empowers it to know those things. Again, they say certain clairvoyants can actually see this. It has a particular shape, but it's embedded within the eyeball, the actual organ, and allows vision to occur, allows one to know objects through the eye sense consciousness. So it empowers, in an uncommon way, the eye sense consciousness to know visible form in those experiences. Our ear consciousness has a similar ear sense power that it depends upon, that is embedded within our ear organ, and that allows us to know sounds. So again, in Western science, I'd say that these sorts of lucid matter don't occur, they don't exist. Nonetheless, they would posit everything still being very dependent upon certain conditions being there in the eyeball, in the ear organ, and what have you. So you do require some sort of physical basis for those to happen. And for the 5 sense consciousnesses, they are all physical bases, albeit lucid matter, very subtle matter. For the mental consciousness, what would anyone recall what the mental sense power was? So it's a prior moment of consciousness, as Stephen said. So you don't have a separate physical organ that the mental consciousness depends upon, but rather it always depends upon a prior moment of consciousness. So the immediate prior moment of consciousness gives rise to that next moment that becomes our mental consciousness. Now, all that happens for all of our other consciousnesses too, but those 5 sensory ones need to be empowered in a physical way to know their objects, because they're physical objects, or their objects are physical. The things that they know are in the external world in a physical way. So when we talk about similar support in regard to this first one, we mean that we can say that then the support for our eye consciousness, knowing blue, as well as for the mental factors that are in its retinue are the eye sense power. For the mental consciousness that is our conceptual mind thinking about the color blue through that mental image, it is the mental sense power for the mental consciousness to arise, and it's also the mental sense power for the mental factors that arise with that. So the mental sense power is the same support. You're never going to have two different supports. You're always going to have the same support. Kind of makes sense, right? Many of these, once you sort of see them, you kind of go, yeah, well, this is what we're talking about, is they arise simultaneously. They arise together, concurrently. So they have to rely upon the same support. The second one, similar object of observation. Since a mental factor also observes that object which the mind observes, their objects of observation are similar. So the mental factor, for example, that factor of feeling that might be present in your mind while your eye consciousness is observing blue, maybe it's a very pleasing blue, and so you have a pleasant sensation, pleasant feeling tone. You have the same object that is being observed by both of those. You can't have a feeling that is being registered to the color red while your eye consciousness is knowing the color blue. Again, these just wouldn't be possible for them to arise in that way. Third, similar subjective aspect. Since when a mind is generated having an aspect, for instance, blue, its mental factor is also generated in that aspect blue. Their subjective aspects are therefore similar. So the idea here is that we say that the subjective awareness, either the mental factor or the mind, are generated in the aspect of that blue, kind of meaning that they subjectively know that blue. You have the object blue that's being known, but they are kind of knowing it in that subjective way. So once more, those cannot be separate. I can't have a feeling mental factor that is having a subjective aspect of red, the color red, whereas my eye consciousness has the object of blue. That's, the subjective aspect of blue. All right. The fourth one, similar time, since a mind and its mental factor are simultaneous, this is the top of page 12, are simultaneous in regard to the three, production, abiding, and cessation, their times are similar. So we kind of talk about these three things going on when we talk about time, that you have kind of the production, meaning something is arising, it abides, and then it ceases. And we have these things happening in a very rapid rate with regard to these individual moments. But we're simply saying that you always have things occurring at the same time. You don't have something that's being produced after the fact. Like my mental factor of feeling arises after my eye consciousness knows blue. It will arise at the same time that is being produced, that it is abiding, and that it ceases. All right? So the timing is always going to be identical. Finally, the fifth one might require a little bit more explanation. This is the similar substance. You might wonder, well, what substance? Just as minds of a similar type are distinct substances, likewise, mental factors such as feelings of a similar type are also distinct substances. Therefore, their substances are similar. It sounds kind of strange. They just called them both distinct, and then they said they're similar. So we need a little bit of an explanation for this. Let me go to what Geshe Rabten says. We're going to also share a little bit of what is said in Mind in Tibetan Buddhism, because they're a little bit different. But he says here, Geshe Rabten says, they have a similar substance since their basic cognitive character is always the same. It never happens, for example, that a primary mind is a perception, whilst one of its mental factors is a conception, or that a mental factor is a mistaken cognition, whilst its accompanying primary mind is an unmistaken cognition. Their cognitive nature or substance is always identical. So if we analyze any particular mind, say, the mind that is understanding emptiness through a conceptual awareness, then we would say that it is either maybe it is a correct assumption about what emptiness is, or maybe it's a mistaken mind. Maybe it hasn't gotten at emptiness correctly. Then we would say that that's the substance that both the minds and the mental factors are going to be, is either mistaken or non-mistaken, in knowing emptiness correctly or not knowing emptiness correctly. But there's other ways that this can be used. Substance can refer to, let me get Lefty Rinpoche's book out, Mind in Tibetan Buddhism, and give you another example that's a little bit different in regard to this. he says here, this means that two different substantial entities of feeling or any other mental factor would not be generated as the accompaniers of one main mind. So what he's saying here is that if you start delineating certain mental factors can have a variety of things experiencing. For example, the feeling factor that I've mentioned earlier and that we're going to go into shortly has three different feelings that can be registered: pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant, as I said earlier. What he's saying this means is that the substance of both the minds and the mental factors are always going to be the same feeling tone. They're not going to be, oh, I've got my other mental factors registering an unpleasant feeling tone while my main mind is registering a pleasant feeling tone, which wouldn't make any sense, because how could you have conflicting experiences of the same object? You might go from moment to moment to have different ones, but in the same moment of time, you can never have variances in that. So substance can be defined in a variety of different ways, it seems. The substance of being the nature of that mind in terms of correct or incorrect, in terms of whether it's direct perception versus conception, so that you couldn't have a direct perception occurring at the same time that a conception is occurring. So, I'm sorry, the mental factors being a direct perception while the mind is being a conception, that type of idea. And you couldn't have a different feeling tone in the mental factors in the mind. They're all going to be of the same substance. I don't know, substance is kind of a weird word, but there's not a lot of other word choices for that. So this one's a little bit more difficult. We're going to see, yeah, Stephen. Yeah, concordant. I think that kind of works, but the idea is whatever we call the substance of that particular mind, and if we started with the main mind and we said, okay, we've got a main mind that is a conception knowing emptiness. We can't have at the same time that the main mind is knowing emptiness conceptually, a mental factor that is knowing emptiness directly through perception rather than, conception. You can't have that kind of mixing, because the substance of the mind is already dictated to some degree. And that has to be concordant. Maybe that is a good word to use in regard to that. But is this kind of clear? Somewhat clear? Okay. We're going to see substance come up again in the very first one of the second presentation of these. You might wonder, well, why do we need two presentations of these? Geshe Gyaltsen is giving us both the lower Abhidharma, Vasubandhu's text first, and then the upper Abhidharma, Asanga's text second. I think on the homework, if you are doing the homework, this is in homework 1, you can simply present one of those. Vasubandhu's is usually the more familiar one that is presented, the one that we just went through, and that's actually the one that Geshe Rabten uses in his book. He doesn't talk about Asanga's, I don't believe. So let's talk about Asanga's. This is again according to his Compendium of Knowledge. The very first of the 5 similarities in that presentation is similar substance, but he means something specifically around feeling, it seems, when he talks about this. On page 12, the description of this says, similar substance refers to the following. In the retinue of a single main mind, there can arise only one mental factor, for instance, feeling, of a similar type. 2 mental factors of a similar type, but of different substances, cannot occur. So again, if you do have mental factors that can have these kinds of variances within them, can have different things registering, you can't have 2 different substances to them. It's just not going to occur. And again, the main mind would always be flavored together with that. So it's kind of strange the way it's described there, but the single main mind would always have only one particular flavor of that mental factor that would have multiple possibilities, such as feeling. Yeah, Bob. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So Bob here in Santa Fe is saying that it kind of is elaborating or reconfirming what we saw earlier in terms of it all being one or one entity. The minds and mental factors kind of arising together. We're parsing them up in our description of them, but we're not really talking about them being substantially different when it comes down to it. There's not something that is totally, antithetical to what's arising. So let's look at the remaining ones, I think these are all pretty straightforward. He kind of lumps 2 and 3 together in his description, similar objective observation and subjective aspect, and then a similar entity. So similar objective observation and subjective aspect and similar entity refer to the following. A mind and the mental factors in its retinue are similar in observing one object, the object of observation. We saw this earlier with Vasubandhu's presentation. And they are similar in being afflicted or non-afflicted in terms of the object of observation and the subjective aspect. So he's maybe going a little bit further and talking about kind of in a flavor to the mind, whether it's afflicted or non-afflicted in the subjective aspect, giving it maybe a little bit different flavor. Then he says, if a main mind has become afflicted, then the mental factors in its retinue also become afflicted. Whereas if a main mind has become uncontaminated, the mental factors in its retinue also become uncontaminated. So he's delineating a bit more about what we mean by the entity of that mind. An uncontaminated mind is a mind that has the direct perception of selflessness, emptiness. And so that mind, by virtue of the strength of that uncontaminated wisdom, that pure wisdom, becomes uncontaminated, and all the mental factors in its retinue become uncontaminated. So we can't have a contaminated mental factor present in the same moment of mind that a main mind is uncontaminated. The fourth one, similar time, refers to the following. A main mind and the mental factors in its retinue are simultaneous in regard to the three, production, abiding, and cessation. That's exactly the same. The one he's adding here is similar realm and level. So similar realm and level refers to the following. If a main mind is a mind of the desire realm including this realm that we are all in here, the human realm, as well as the God realm, demigod realm, the three lower realms of animal, hungry ghost, and hell realms. Those are all the desire realms. If a main mind is a mind of the desire realm, then it is impossible for a mental factor of the form or formless realms to arise in its retinue. And it is impossible for a mental factor of the desire realm to arise in the retinue of a mind of the form realm. So you might wonder, what's the form and formless realm? Earlier I mentioned these 4 concentrations that you need for clairvoyance. When you generate those minds, and even when you generate the mind of calm abiding, it said you generate a form realm mind. You generate a mind that is not of the desire realm because you are already separating to some degree, making non-manifest the afflictions of the desire realm. And so those 4 concentrations, actually, as you practice them, you are creating unmoving karma that will facilitate a rebirth in those lower realms. They actually are a physical realm, the form realm. Much subtler realm than what we exist in, and they don't have all of the senses, and they don't have many of the negative experiences, present suffering that is gross and so on, but they nonetheless are still in a state of samsara. Then we have the formless realm, where you can continue that process. After developing the 4 concentrations, you develop what are called the 4 formless absorptions. And actually a rebirth in the formless realm can occur on the basis of that karma that you're creating. And that is a rebirth where you don't have any gross form at all. It said, according to the Tantric teachings, you have very subtle wind always with the mind, but you don't have anything beyond that. You don't have any physical form that would be present. So those two, are their own sort of entity by virtue of what you've done in the work in generating those mind states. And so you can't have a mind of the form realm present in a formless, or a mental factor of the form realm present in a mind of the formless realm. You can't have a mental factor of the desire realm present in a mind of the form realm, because these are kind of separate by realm. You can't generate a lower consciousness on the basis of a higher awareness. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. 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 So Bob's comment was really that, yeah, we're seeing that same point that we saw earlier. And here it's just trying to parse it up in terms of looking at these 3 different realms. Sometimes you even see that phrase, beings of the 3 realms. And you might wonder, what are these 3 realms? It's the desire, form, and formless. Mostly we talk about beings of the 6 realms, which is where we get into the different realms of the desire realm, the ones that I mentioned. And you could even include form and formless realm into the gods when you talk about the 6 realms of beings. So let's finish this off in terms of, it says here, that realm in which the main mind is included is also necessarily the realm in which the mental factor in its retinue is included. Okay, so if you have a main mind of the desire realm, all your mental factors that are in the retinue of that mind are going to be in the desire realm. And the same for form, the same for formless realm. All right. Then we covered this material that goes from here to, we jump now to page 15 to begin our exploration of the mental factors. Before we do that, though, I wanted to share just a little bit from these slides. I think I got these from Emily Sue, who was my classmate in the master's program, and she's taught here in Santa Fe before. She put together some slides that she used in her presentation, and this is just to also highlight this whole idea of why we're doing this study, is because we really need to also understand through those 5 similarities that we looked at, that we're talking about really the quality of our minds. And the quality of our minds is what dictates, therefore, the experiences that we have in terms of samsara, in terms of nirvana, enlightenment, and so on. So this slide she put together says the quality of a mind depends upon the mental factors that accompany it. So this definitely is spelling out, a relationship that we need to be attentive to. So if the mental factors are virtuous, the mind becomes virtuous. If the mental factors are non-virtuous, the mind becomes non-virtuous. And if the mental factors are neutral, the mind becomes neutral. So this is giving us fuel for why we want to do this type of investigation, is to clearly understand and know what are the mental factors that are in the nature of virtue, that will thereby influence our minds to be in the nature of virtue and help us to create the positive karma that will allow us to at least have a good rebirth, to eventually generate nirvana, to eventually achieve enlightenment. Whereas those that are non-virtuous, that we've been following since beginningless time, we need to be quite attentive to in uprooting and counteracting. Yeah, Bob. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so to right. Okay. So yeah. So yeah. So Bob's question is can you have a mixing of virtuous and non-virtuous in the mind at a single time? And the answer would be no, because any one that is present that is non-virtuous is going to exclude the arisal of something that is virtuous, and vice versa. So if we have a virtuous state of mind present, we can't have one that is non-virtuous. Now we're going to get into more clearly defining what we mean by virtue and non-virtue, because the categories of mental factors that we're going to be going into, one whole set is called the virtuous mental factors, and they by their very nature are virtuous. If we practice any one of those 11, we will be inducing a virtuous state of mind. Non-virtue becomes a little bit harder to delineate exactly, because we get into what are called the afflictions, and the afflictions, every single one of them is not necessarily non-virtuous. A good part of them are. So we'll be exploring this. But we see that, for example, when we have attachment present, we cannot have non-attachment, which is a virtuous mind present. Attachment by its very nature is going to be a non-virtuous mental factor. And so it by attachment being present, we cannot have a non-attachment present in the same moment. If we have non-attachment present, it disallows attachment from being there. So there are some that are quite clear opposites to each other. But nonetheless, the general flavor of what we are inducing by virtue of what mental factors we're introducing and cultivating, that will dictate what state of mind we have, and that will keep the opposite from arising. Okay. But they can obviously change from moment to moment, as Jane was pointing out. Things do move back and forth. It's not like in many of our actions we have maybe moments of virtue that arise and then moments of non-virtue that compete with them, and and we go through this struggle, if you will. That's what our minds are constantly doing, in terms of these different states of that are arising. But it's the mental factors that dictate that. But the mental factors, again, as I was mentioning, many of these that we're going to talk about are conceptually induced. It's not like they're a life of their own, like they're just arising. Like feeling, for example, is definitely just arising on the basis of all the various things that we experience. And we have some karma that dictates that. Why do some people like the taste of chocolate and other people hate the taste of chocolate? Why do some people like the smell of incense and other people hate the smell of incense? It's because the smell in and of itself isn't pleasant or unpleasant. It's being translated as that by the mental factor of feeling that we each have that dictates what we're experiencing. So this will be something we'll be exploring in terms of all the various things that lead up to this. But this is to drive home this understanding that if we channel our energy into creating virtuous states of mind, virtuous mental factors, we create virtuous states of mind from which virtuous actions will ensue. If we continue to cultivate non-virtuous mental factors, then we are going to have non-virtuous states of mind and non-virtuous karma arising on the basis of that. And neutral, well, we do a lot of neutral stuff. Neutral just kind of doesn't really have a lot of power within, our experiences. But let's go to one more slide that Emily had. Maybe even have two more. The relationship here continues in talking about the quality of the mind by saying non-virtuous mental factors cause suffering and virtuous mental factors cause happiness. Therefore, if we want to achieve lasting happiness, we must try to cultivate virtuous mental factors and eliminate non-virtuous ones. So this is just to tie that previous slide into the whole idea of karma. Why we are paying attention to all this is that the Buddha is not delineating things as good, bad. He's simply observing it and saying, if you engage in cultivating virtuous states of mind, virtuous mental factors, you are going to create the causes for happiness. If you cultivate non-virtuous mental factors, then you're going to create the causes for suffering. It's just a simple law of cause and effect. So we have a choice. If we want to achieve lasting happiness, we have to try to cultivate the virtuous ones and eliminate the non-virtuous ones. Nonetheless, that's not all we're going to be studying. That's a good part of what we're going to be studying for the remainder of this course, because we also have to know the various other functions that are involved, because many of them, again, are delineated by the Buddha because of their relevance to what is happening in regard to states of mind that induce our experiences of suffering or happiness. Okay. The final slide in this, maybe there's more than that. Sorry, I only get to see one previewed at a time. These are a couple things from Geshe Rabten on the quality of the mind. He says here, the character of a primary mind is thus determined by its constituent mental factors. He uses slightly different language. He says, if an unwholesome factor is present, the entire mind becomes unwholesome. Whereas if a wholesome factor is present, the entire mind takes on a wholesome aspect. This is similar to adding sugar or salt to a glass of water. With the addition of either substance, the whole glass of water becomes flavored with their taste. It is in this way that the individual mental factors exert their influence over the primary state of mind, coloring its disposition and activating its potential to manifest in outward activity. Because that's the other side of it. It's not just all happening in our minds. It's already creating karma by happening in our minds, but then we act on the basis of that. We have those thoughts of attachment, and then we, do things that are motivated by that and that bring about suffering because of those actions being together with attachment or anger or whatever the case might be. All right. Any questions on this idea of the quality of the mind? Yeah, Charmaine. Sure. Charmaine's question is, it seems kind of dangerous, and how volitional really is, this whole process of working with this. That's, again, the main impetus for this type of study is to get to know our mind so that we can have more volition, more kind of control over it. We always use that phrase, being under the control of karma and delusions. Why? Because this is a state that we generally are in. But it doesn't mean that we're stuck in that control. Otherwise, again, the third noble truth wouldn't be possible. You couldn't have a true cessation of our suffering if we were always under the control of these factors without any means of controlling them ourselves. So cessation is possible because we can make steps towards initially trying to combat them through having just an awareness of them, knowing when they're arising, introducing antidotes, developing different states of mind in their absence, in the place of them. And so we can do all of this to overcome them eventually. And then, of course, the final way we overcome them is by knowing the wisdom of emptiness that all of these delusions are based on. Sure. I mean, yeah, yeah. So Charmaine's question has to do with choice, she says, and the idea of merit influencing choice, so that the more merit that we have, the greater awareness that we have of the choice that we have, and the more impetus that we can where does the initial choice come from, or where? Well, again, everything is a complex sea of stuff going on. I mean, if we start thinking about things as being too linear, I think we're going to get stuck because there's so much going on in terms of different influences that we have in our existences that, some lama, when we were a worm, giving us a mantra or something, reciting a mantra into our little worm ears. I don't even know if worms have ears, but you know what I'm saying? It's like there's like all this stuff going on. It's very complex and things interweaving. And so while we tend to think of things as being quite linear, and we're going to go on this path that leads from our deluded state to enlightenment out there, it's quite complex because we have so many different factors influencing it. But every single being has some store of merit, and every single being has certainly their share of delusion and negative karma. Absolutely. And all of that, as Jane's pointing out, is based on the idea of Buddha nature, that we can make choices then and can further this because our fundamental nature is pure, and everything that we are combating is not in the nature of our mind inherently. It can all be removed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and the function of the enlightened beings, who are always there to try to plant the seeds of virtue in every single sentient being's minds in whatever way that they can. I mean, that's what Lama Tsongkhapa starts with in the foundation of all good qualities, right? It's the kind and venerable guru. Everything, all the happiness arises from the beings who are trying to get us there, trying to influence us. And so it happens in many, many ways. And it's quite complex, though, again, because you might look at it and go, well, but if when I was a worm, how did I have the karma to receive that mantra from the guru or whatever? Well, that's, again, saying that there must have been some store of virtue that you had that was allowed you to be in that place to receive the mantra from the guru. So, yeah, it's all quite complex, but we can't make it that linear then again. Otherwise, I think so, yeah. So again, yeah, I mean, it's quite complex because we obviously say, yeah, there are causes and conditions that are behind everything that is occurring, but it doesn't mean that we can't affect those causes and conditions going forward, or that we're stuck in some sort of circular mode and never being able to generate enough force to get out of it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I can't quite reword exactly what Charbet just said, but the idea is that, again, the virtue that we generate influences the virtue that we will generate in the future. I mean, this is why we want to move in that direction where we are trying to cultivate more and more virtue and generate less and less non-virtue, because what we do has that karmic effect as well. This is one of our karmic results, right? That we have behavior that is similar to what we've done in the past. Right. Right. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Right. Okay. Right. So Charmaine was just recounting what Venerable Rabin often says about the prisoners in LPP and their lack of merit to be able to sustain practice and get the materials they need and all the various things. There's many obstacles in prison work. But anyway, that, yeah, we're kind of the same. We're just dealing with different conditions, but we've got the same sort of obstacles we have to overcome. But there is choice in every moment when we become cognizant of choice. But nonetheless, for most beings, they don't have much cognizance of choice because they're under the control of this wave of delusion and past karma that just propels them in the same direction. Not to say that, again, there isn't the potential to have that change. There is always, because of Buddha nature, because it's not inherently there, there's always the potential for change. But once we kind of become cognizant of this, then we're like, oh, wow, I am in the driver's seat and I need to really do something different because where I've been driving myself hasn't really worked out so well. I need to, yeah, 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 yeah. Good. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Again, the terminology you're using is maybe not exactly in line with some of what we use here, but nonetheless, this idea of awareness, increasing our awareness, Tony, is really important because as we become aware of more stuff, that's the whole that's where all the effort has to be. You have to have awareness, and again, the mental factors that we're going to look at are quite applicable to generating that, to being able to have the insight and the mindfulness and all of that we need to have that will contribute to our spiritual practice. So yeah, one more question. I want to check in with the folks online and make sure that they're getting a chance to answer any questions they have. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, no, Bob was just saying that it becomes clear to him that the underlying delusion is always ignorance. Because ignorance, we frequently talk about ignorance of the nature of reality, but there's ignorance of karma even, which most beings are dealing with in this world. It's not having the cognizance that everything that they do with their minds, their speech, their bodies is producing this force by which they will be experiencing in the future, happiness, suffering, what have you. You know. Concordant effects, that arise from those causes. So let me check in with the folks online, and I haven't forgotten all of you. Make sure that people get a chance to say something if they'd like to. So I think all of you have your microphones or muted, so you'd have to unmute if you want to ask anything. Anyone? Okay, nothing there. So if there's no other questions here, let me just do a little bit more because it's 8:08. I just want to introduce these mental factors. So what I have to do here is another share screen. Oh, I got something on the chat. Let me take a look at that. Oh, okay, that was just something else. Let's see. Let me go to the share screen again. All right. So I think they should have that now, the relationship one. We're going on then to introducing these mental factors. I may have mentioned this earlier that there are 6 groups of these. Oh, did someone have a question?
Oh, sorry, John, we can't see the slide.
Oh, you can't see the slide. I didn't. Okay, let me. All right, there I go. Let me try this again. Shoot, somehow. Okay, there it is. Now what I have to do, I'm still learning this software. This is going to be sometimes a challenge, I think. Okay, now I think when I do share screen, there it is. Okay. All right. I think you should have it now. So these are divided into 6 groups. And again, this is also on page 15 of your text. The first one that we're going to look at are the 5 omnipresent or always present, always there in the mind. We're going to look at what this means when we go into that. These 5 are generally there with every consciousness, every main mind that is present. The next 5 are what are called object ascertaining mental factors, which are there present whenever an object is being ascertained or known. So it's not to say that they're present all the time, but most of the time we are ascertaining objects. So these are close to omnipresent, but not, completely in that category. Then we're going to look at the 11 virtuous mental factors. I just mentioned them a short while ago. These are really good to get to know because these are the states of mind that we want to induce, that we want to make very strong. Then we're going to look at the 6 root afflictions. Some of you may say, well, aren't there 3 root afflictions? And yes, there are 3. Those 3 are included in the 6. This presentation elaborates to include 3 additional mental factors. The 6 root afflictions, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of them, or the main way that they are manifesting, is in producing non-virtue. Nonetheless, there can be some of them that are not necessarily specified as virtuous or non-virtuous. For example, the ignorance that's adhering to inherent existence. You can have that present even when you have a virtuous mind, right? Say you are being generous to somebody, giving money to somebody, but you're not addressing that ignorance in any way. You're not thinking about, I, the giver, lack inherent existence, and you, the recipient, don't exist from your own side, and it's all merely imputed. You don't have any of that wisdom present. So you're not counteracting your ignorance. Your ignorance is still present with it, but it's a virtuous state of mind, the mind of generosity, the mind that's giving out of compassion, loving kindness, what have you. So again, this is just to delineate something that isn't absolute in terms of when we use the word affliction, we're not meaning it to be equivalent to non-virtue. Nonetheless, most of the afflictions are non-virtuous in their nature. Then we're going to go through the 20 secondary that are extensions of the 3 root delusions of ignorance, attachment, and anger or hatred. And then finally, what are called the 4 changeable mental factors. Again, this is also on page 15, right after this question, where it says, this is from a discussion of the 5 aggregates, which I think is by Vasubandhu. He says, what are these phenomena that are mental factors? Literally that which arise from the mind. And the response is they are phenomena concomitant with the mind. And when they're divided, there are these 51. So the final one, the changeable ones, are variable, in dependence upon one's motivation or a particular situation. They do change their nature. Then they can become virtuous or non-virtuous. But that is true for some of these others. But the other ones, it's by virtue of something else being there. These themselves can change based on the motivation we bring to them, and you'll see that when we finally get to those. So then in conclusion to that introduction, it says, thus it is just as it has been said in a discussion of the 5 aggregates. 5 are omnipresent, 5 ascertain objects individually, 11 are virtues, 6 are afflictions, others are secondary afflictions, and 4 are changeable. So the 5 omnipresent that we'll be looking at when we reconvene next week, again, I'll just do a little introduction to these. These 5 mental factors are called omnipresent because they accompany or arise with all main minds. Feeling, discrimination, intention, contact, and then what we call attention. Some texts might have mental engagement or other names for that. Even discrimination sometimes has different words for it. Geshe Rabdin calls it discernment, for example. Does anyone recognize any of these from, what about, which ones? The first 2. Okay, so everyone goes, yeah, the first 2, the feeling and discrimination. So in the Heart Sutra, when we say that there's no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. So we're actually going to see these 5 aggregates. They're on another slide coming up. We'll look at that next week. But know that 2 of the aggregates, which is a presentation the Buddha did to kind of show 5 main components that are the basis for a person. We can also divide phenomena that are created, that are compounded into those five. But nonetheless, the main way that the Buddha used the term the five aggregates was to talk about them as the basis for a person. So each of you have five aggregates. You have your aggregate of form, which is your physical component, which encompasses all of your physical body. And then you have the remaining four are all involved in your mind. Two of the first two are these two mental factors that are always present, and they are delineated in the listing of the five aggregates because they play a key role in terms of how we generate particular problems in our lives, how we, you'll see this as we go through feeling and discrimination, the role that they play in helping to induce a lot of our deluded states of mind. So we need to be quite attentive to these two because they're operating all the time, and they can be used to our benefit or they can be used to our detriment. Yes, Rachel. Yes. Well, no, actually, it's not. My understanding is that Rachel's question was, is it one of the 12 links contact? It's not equivalent to what's in the 12 links because in 12 links there's a slightly different variation on it. But nonetheless, it's similar. In the 12 links of dependent arising, some of you know. I think there's one commentary where that says it actually, we can't say that it is exactly the mental factor because it's more of the experience of all those coming together and being known, the aggregation of whereas this is the mental factor of contact. So anyway, we'll get to contact. That's coming up too. And then these last three that are on here, intention, contact, and attention, as well as the other 45 mental factors that are out there, they're all included in the aggregate of compositional factors. So again, we had no form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors. Compositional factors includes the 49, which would be the three here, I guess 46, sorry, not 45, 46. The remaining mental factors would all be included in that bucket of compositional factors. And then finally, the fifth aggregate of consciousness is that main mind, that general awareness that all of this is taking place in. So the Buddha was delineating that we each have these kind of five components that are part of our experience, and he was picking out these first two mental factors that we're going to look at as really important to pay attention to, because, as I said, they are really one of the main ways that we get into trouble. They say for lay people, we get kind of caught up in our feelings, going after pleasurable things and trying to avoid unpleasant. For those who are ordained or studying, more intently philosophy and what have you, it's discrimination because they become quite discriminatory in their views and then often adhere to those views in ways that are not so beneficial. Yeah. So anyway, we'll see this as this unfolds. I think that's good enough. It's 8:17, so I think we can conclude tonight. Let me stop the share so we can bring folks back on screen to some degree. All right, so let's go ahead and end tonight with the prayers on page 235. And if any of you have any additional questions from tonight, I think everyone's got my email address. Feel free to send them to me. Sometimes it's easier if I get questions between the classes and then I can address them at the beginning. It's a little bit hard sometimes to address all the questions here. So page 235, we'll do the first two prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Page 244. 244, we'll do the two prayers there for our precious teachers, His Holiness, as well as Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And as we recite these two prayers, think that we're creating the causes for all of our gurus to have good health and long lives, to continue to remain in this world, and for us and others to never be parted from perfect gurus. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, just dedicate for anyone who you're holding in your heart right now. There may be individuals or even groups of people or parts of the world where the suffering that is being experienced moves us greatly, and we want to dedicate for the relief of that suffering. So whether this be beings who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died, whatever their suffering is, may it be relieved by virtue of what we have done here tonight. May these beings also find all the perfect causes for true happiness and peace. And may this be so for all sentient beings by virtue of our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. Just so you know, the videos that we're doing on Zoom seem to work really well, and I went ahead and set up a YouTube page that's open to the public that's under my name. Because it was easier, because they're being downloaded to my computer. So if you ever want to watch one of those, I'll try to get those uploaded within a day or so after the class. Keep in mind there is no class next week because of Medicine Buddha Puja. We're doing it for the full moon on that Wednesday. Initially, we weren't sure whether Venerable Rubina was going to join us or not for that night, and don't think that she will be, but you never know. So we will have class on the following Wednesday, which is February 7th. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Don.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Good night.